Chapter 8. He's cute. Very cute. Jill here. Now it's my turn. I didn't know John, or Johnny as he was known then. I had no idea who he was when I saw him that day on the street. I had no idea because at that stage of my life it was all about me. My parents were very working class. We lived in Housing Commission in Glenroy. My mother was a stay-at-home mum and she was tough, very tough. My dad had stood over 6'4". He was lanky, skinny and very quiet, probably because he was the only man in a household of women. I loved my dad, and although it was an acceptable part of parenting at the time, he never smacked us. He gave us this look. You know that look. Mum smacked us, but Dad never did. He'd give us his look. And because he was a manual labourer, he had huge hands. I'd look at his hands and think, oh no, I don't think so. And I'd stop being cheeky, quick smart. He was a really hard worker, my dad. He was a labourer during the day. Then he'd go off to other jobs, printing the Age newspaper at night. Then he'd get home at 6 a.m, get a couple of hours sleep, then get up and go off to his labouring job again. He did that 5 days a week. And on the weekend, he kept busy too. He'd be up at 7:30 on the Sunday morning, mowing the bloody lawn. I think it was partly to keep away from Mum and all of us girls. I was the youngest of 4 sisters. I was the dainty, cute one with ringlets who did ballet from a young age, whereas my older sisters were all into competitive horse riding. My second eldest sister moved out when I was young, so there were 3 of us girls left in the family home by the time I was a teenager. We'd all get our periods at the same time, and there would be lots of arguments between us all. Poor Dad was as quiet as all get out, but even then we'd tell him to shut up all the time. What would you know, Dad? We'd scream at him. Poor old bugger. No wonder he worked so hard. It gave him an excuse to stay away. All those ballet lessons paid off, and I was considered a gifted dancer. So much so that I got written permission to leave school at 14 to study under the tutelage of prima ballerina Kathleen Gorham. Kathy had danced in Paris and London and then came home to be principal dancer with the newly founded Australian Ballet Company. I studied under Kathy for more than a year and always wanted to earn my living as a dancer. When I turned 15, I auditioned for the production of Promises, Promises, starring American actor Orson Bean, which was a musical based on the 1960 film The Apartment. I lied at the audition telling everyone I was 16, and I got the job, and that was that. I had realised my childhood dream and become a professional dancer. I was only a teenager, but I clearly knew what I wanted and basically moved out of home when the show started. As far as Mum and Dad were concerned, I was still technically living in Glenroy, but I was never there. I danced 6 nights a week, twice on Saturdays and twice on Wednesdays. On the top of that, many nights after work, my castmates and I would go out to a club. Being a dancer in the theatre back then was like joining another family. It was tight-knit, very protective and a lot of fun. We worked hard and played even harder. You'd finish a 2-hour show at 10:30 at night, race back to the dressing room, take your theatre makeup off, put on a fresh streety, makeup to wear on the street, that is, and go out to the nightclubs for more dancing. The guys in the chorus were all gay, and they would take us to gay clubs, which were illegal in those days. Because they were illegal, the parties had to change venues often. So it was all word of mouth, which made it all the more exciting. The gay clubs always had the best music. We'd go off to these clubs with the guys, and there were often these big, round, raised pedestals where people would get up and dance. The boys would throw one of us up there and want us to dance for them. So we did. I loved it. We barely slept before going back to work the next day. There were drugs around, but I never got involved with that scene. I didn't even drink. I didn't need to. I was high on the fact that I was dancing professionally. I had trained hard since I was a child, and now I was doing exactly what I'd always wanted. It was fantastic. I was young and tall and skinny and beautiful, as we all were when we were bloody 16. I really was having the time of my life. I was in Promises for around 10 months, first in Melbourne, and then we travelled to Sydney, and then went straight into dancing in Casino de Paris, another musical come Vegas type show. I actually started rehearsals for Casino while I was still doing Promises. There were quite a number of dancers who were doing the same thing. We'd perform at night and then rehearse during the day. When Promises closed in Sydney, we went back to Melbourne and did Casino at Her Majesty's Theatre. Casino travelled up to Sydney too, and I went with it. When the run finished, I worked as a showgirl at the Chevron in Melbourne. It was a cabaret club, and I had to walk around wearing feathers and looked fabulous. I lied about my age, again, because I was still a minor. Then I got cast in Charlie Girl and started rehearsal with the leads. I knew who Derek Nimmo and Dame Anna Nagel were. They were both theatre stars from London, but I had no idea who Johnny Farnham was. We were in rehearsals, and at the same time there was a play on called 1776, starring an Australian actor by the name of Lewis Fiander. Lewis and I were good pals. One day we grabbed some lunch together and were walking back to Her Madge when, just as we got to the stage door, John and Daryl walked out. I looked at John and thought, he's cute, very cute. I didn't go into the theatre. Instead, I stopped and watched him walk across the road. When he got halfway across, he turned back and looked at me. In that moment, we locked eyes. Then he turned and just kept walking. I thought, he's got to be gay. He's too handsome and too pretty to be straight. And then I went inside for the afternoon session of rehearsals. 10 days later, we were in the middle of rehearsals when John came in. At some point in the afternoon, we got chatting. I still thought he was gay. I had been around a lot of gay men, and I thought I knew who was gay and who wasn't. John continued coming to rehearsals, and I was aware of him wherever he was in the room. Then one day I went to the bathroom and got stuck in there. The door was jammed and it wouldn't open. John kicked the door down. He rescued me. After that, I saw him in a completely different light. I thought to myself, hello, that was very butch. From that day onward, he started wooing me, and that wooing turned into us courting. That sounds so old-fashioned, but that's how it was. It took him ages to get a kiss from me. He started with flirting, catching each other's eye and lingering touches. John started bringing me hot chocolate, then roses. He'd buy a fresh rose at a local florist each day and bring it to me. When Charlie Girl season opened, I still hadn't given him a kiss. There was 8 weeks of courting during rehearsals, and then it was 3 weeks after opening night before we finally kissed. John took me out to dinner once in those early days, and it was the first time I'd ever had oysters. And no, I didn't like them. It was like swallowing snot. But I ate them thinking I've got to look like I'm sophisticated, like I know what I'm doing. There was this wine back then called Blue Nun. If you ordered a bottle of Blue Nun, you were the ant's pants. It was a very sweet German wine and it was ghastly. John ordered a bottle of Blue Nun and I thought, oh no, I've got to be the good girl and drink it. It was revolting. When John and I weren't at work, we'd snatch time together wherever we could. We couldn't be seen in public because we didn't want to start rumours. We couldn't go to John's apartment because Daryl was always turning up unannounced. So we'd hang out at friends' places. They'd go to work and leave the key out for us. John and I would have our little rendezvous in their houses. Or we'd pack lunches and a flask and go out on his boat. For years to come, if John asked if I wanted to go out on his boat, it was code for, "Would you like a kiss and a cuddle?" One night, halfway through the performance, John proposed to me. I was downstairs in the girls' dressing room just before the end of interval. There was a knock at the door and one of the girls sang out, "Jill, John's at the door." I was half naked because you never sat around in your costumes if you didn't have to. So I grabbed a house coat, raced to the door, opened it and said, "Yeah?" John said, "Will you marry me?" And I said, "Yes." He then slammed the door, raced upstairs and went on stage. It was not at all romantic. I stood there thinking, what did I just do? After the show, he asked me again properly in his dressing room. He got down on his knee and I said yes a second time. I was very young, too young, and I hadn't known John for long, but I just knew. And I was lucky. I mean, it could have been a leg up. My legs were already up, but it could have gone completely wrong. And you know, today, as I put these memories down, is our wedding anniversary. Don't get me wrong, we had our ups and downs. Relationships aren't easy. I think the problem with many people today, they go into marriage and think it's all going to be roses and butterflies. They don't realise you actually have to work at it. You've got two people living together with two different opinions. Sometimes you're looking at them and thinking, I just want to kill you. You know, I want to grab you and smash your face in. That's how irritated you get. In the beginning, John wouldn't argue with me. It was so frustrating. I wanted a reaction, and he'd just sit there. The no reaction thing would make me more angry. I wanted to grab a book or a plate or whatever I could smash to provoke him. Of course I didn't. In the end, I said to John one day, "Please give me something. I need someone to vent at, and it's you." So yeah, we worked at our relationship. Once John's fans started to get wind we were dating, I became a target. Mum and Dad would get prank phone calls, and one day a girl knocked at our front door. Luckily it was the weekend and Dad was home, because when he opened the door, she was standing there with a knife. Another time I was walking into the theatre. There were about 10 of John's young fans in the foyer. They saw me and started bullying me about John. After a few minutes, I'd had enough, and I said to them, "Yeah, we are dating." They were so stunned that I admitted it, they left me alone. Over the years, a small number of John's fans have given me a hard time because they always thought they'd be the one to marry him. But 99.999% of them are really cool. As we've all gotten older, they settled down because they realised that I'm here to stay. They had to accept that John is with me, and that ain't going to change. But the fans were never the main threat to our relationship. Daryl Samble was our major concern. Before we met, John had had affairs or one-night stands with women, but he was never in one place long enough to form a real relationship. Daryl made sure of it. Even being together on Charlie Girl, it was hard to find free time to spend together. We did 2 shows on Saturday, and then on Sunday, Daryl would drag John off to Brisbane or Adelaide or somewhere else around the country to do shows. I found out from friends that Daryl was paying people in the cast to spy on John. When Daryl found out about us, all hell broke loose. John invited me to some of the parties that were raging around him, but we soon stopped going because Daryl would say awful things to me constantly. Daryl was like Rasputin. He surrounded himself with like-minded bullies and predators. I couldn't stand any of them. One day there was a barbecue on the banks of the Yarra. John was running late and I got there a bit early, so I sat next to this guy and we were chatting. We were just sitting on a bench talking when Daryl marched up to me. He was being loud, flamboyant and showing off in front of everybody, and then he tried to embarrass me. He said to me at the top of his lungs, "You need to be careful because I will make sure John's never in Melbourne again." It took me aback for a minute. I had already seen how Daryl worked John and kept him isolated from his family and friends. I thought, bugger this, so I said to him, "No, Daryl, you need to be careful because I'll make sure you don't have a job." I figured I'd better stand up for myself and for John because no one else was going to. Daryl was frightened to let go because he knew if he let go, John would be gone. Speaking up didn't make things any better. Once Daryl left me stranded on an island in the Whitsundays. Derek Nimmo, his wife Pat, and another gentleman by the name of Robin Bowring, and his girlfriend at the time, his name I can't remember, joined Daryl, John and me for a trip to Brampton Island. John and I weren't allowed to share a room because we weren't married, so I was sharing with Robin's girlfriend. A journalist and photographer from TV Week were coming, and Daryl said to me, "You need to get out of here because of the press." He didn't want them to know Johnny had a girlfriend. I agreed. So Daryl put me on a plane to Hamilton Island, which in those days wasn't as flash as it is now. He arranged for me to stay with one of the singers in the chorus. I'm sure she was one of his in-house spies. Daryl had said, "Don't worry, it'll only be for a couple of days." 5 days later, I had no money and I was completely stuck. Eventually, I got a call through to John. "Where are you?" he asked. He expected me back, and God knows what Daryl had told him to explain why I wasn't there. I explained I was stuck on Hamilton Island because Daryl wanted me to stay away. Well, the shit hit the fan then, and John demanded that I was put on the next plane back to Brampton Island. That was the way Daryl worked. Conniving, very conniving. When the bullying didn't work, Daryl tried to get rid of me by having me fired. Ken Brodziak, KB as we called him, was the producer of Charlie Girl and hugely influential. He was a very powerful man, and although I knew who he was, I'd never spoken to him directly. So when I was called into his office, I was very intimidated. Obviously, Daryl had spoken to Ken and given him an ultimatum. Either she goes or I'll pull John out of the show. KB said to me, "You need to break off this relationship." I was young and quite shocked. I just sat there and looked at him. When he was finished, I got up, walked downstairs and found John. I told him, "I've just been called to KB's office. They're going to sack me if we keep seeing each other." That was it for John. He marched up to KB's office and told him straight, "If she goes, I go." KB was an entrepreneur. This was the man who brought the Beatles to Australia, for God's sake. He would have known what it would cost him to lose Johnny Farnham. But more than that, KB respected John for sticking up for himself. It pleased him that John was pushing for what he wanted, and what John wanted was me. 51 years of marriage and we're still together.